She came off the evening train into a wind that carried wood smoke and the raw tang of rendered fat, carrying a single trunk with a broken hasp, and the kind of stillness the men lounging outside the depot mistook for meekness. It was not meekness. Adeline Pruitt had buried a husband and a whole life's worth of plans in a city 1,000 miles east, and she had come out to the high Colorado parks to stand in the wind of a town she had never heard of a year before, and she had not made that journey to be afraid of a little weather. Emmett Rourke had written away for a pair of hands the way another man might order a barrel of lye or a load of tallow, because the work was more than one grieving man and an old hired fellow with ruined joints could carry, and because the house and the little soapworks along Ute Creek had gone quiet as a grave in the 2 years since the fever took Ruth, and because a chandler who cannot keep his kettles going has no trade left and no name either. He wanted somebody plain and strong who would stir the lye and pack the candle molds and mind the child and otherwise leave a man alone with his grief. He expected to be disappointed, the way he had come to expect it of most things. What Emmett Rourke did not know, standing there at the edge of the depot platform with his hat crushed in one fist and his whole failing work sliding month by month toward a merchant's ledger, was that the woman climbing down off that train had forgotten more about soap and lye and worth than any man in the territory would learn in a lifetime, and that she had come west guarding a recipe and a small hard hoard sewn into the lining of that broken trunk, and that before the aspens turned to gold, she would take his crude, caustic, unsellable soap and remake it into something the whole high country lined up to buy, and change the entire accounting of his life. If this story speaks to you, tap that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was the spring of 1883, in the High Park country along Ute Creek, a day's ride above the mountain town of Cavell, Colorado, where the land ran up in long green benches toward peaks that still wore snow in June, and the wind came down off those peaks every evening smelling of pine and cold water, and never entirely stopped. The train had set her down a little before 6 and gone on grinding up the grade without her, and for a while nobody came. She stood with one gloved hand on the trunk and let the town look at her, because she had crossed enough hard country by then to know that a woman standing alone in a strange street with nothing to do with her hands is asking to be looked at. And she had no intention of asking Cavell for one single thing. The depot sat at the low end of a single dusty street, and the street ran up between a livery and a bank and a big false-fronted mercantile with the name Merrow painted across it in letters a foot high. And in the doorway of that mercantile 2 women stood with a bolt of calico between them and priced her the way a woman prices goods she does not mean to buy. One of them was named Hessie Task, and she was married to the man who kept the feed store, and she considered the whole length of that street her own front parlor, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry down the boardwalk, that it was a shame. And she said it twice, and she meant something unkind by it both times. She said Rourke had gone and sent away for one now, as if a dead wife was a thing a man set right by riding off to an agency, and that the poor creature likely did not know what she was walking into, up a bad road to a place the whole valley had already crossed off its books. She said the Rourke works was finished, that Cyrus Merrow held the paper on it, and everybody knew Cyrus Merrow always collected, and that there was the little girl to think of, growing up wild out there with a broke chandler and nobody to raise her. Adeline heard all of it. She stood with her back straight and her gloves folded over the strap of the trunk and looked at the snow on the peaks above the roofline and gave no sign that a word of it had reached her. And her silence was not ignorance, and there was nobody on that boardwalk with the training to tell the difference. Emmett Rourke came for her at 6:30 with a buckboard and a single dun horse that stood quiet and gaunt in the traces. And he did not apologize for the hour she had waited. He was tall and gone lean in the way of men who have stopped eating regular, near 36, with 3 days of dark beard and a hat sweated pale at the band and hands stained and cracked at the knuckles from years of caustic work. He looked at the trunk with its broken hasp. He looked at her. He said he supposed she was the one the agency had written him about, since he had not written the letter himself, his hand being no good for it, and old Alton had done the writing. She said her name was Adeline Pruitt, and put out her hand, and Emmett Rourke took it before he had quite decided to, and she felt him feel the strength in it, the grip of a woman who had worked, and the ridge of an old lye burn healed white across the back of her own knuckles, and she watched him notice that scar and decide, out of some tired courtesy, not to remark on it. He swung the trunk up into the box as though it weighed nothing, and she saw him register that it weighed a good deal more than a trunk of a poor widow's clothes ought to weigh, and again he said nothing. She climbed up onto the seat without waiting to be helped, and settled her skirts and folded her hands, and they went up out of Cavell along the creek road, with the water running loud and cold on their left, and the benches rising green and stubbled with new grass on their right. Emmett Rourke did not talk, and that suited her. But she watched the country the whole way, and she watched it the way a person watches who is reading it and not admiring it, and about 2 miles up the road she caught the smell before she saw the place. The thick yellow reek of a rendering fire and old ash and tallow, gone the least bit rancid. And her nose told her 3 things about how the work was being done up there before the road even turned to show her the buildings, and not one of the 3 was good. She said nothing about that either. She only asked him, in her level, unhurried voice, how much lye he leached in a week, and Emmett Rourke's head came around, because it was not a question a hired housekeeper asks, and he said, slow, that they ran off maybe 4 or 5 barrels of ash lye when the hoppers were going, and made rough soft soap of it, and dipped what candles the mines would take. She asked what he tested the lye with. He said he did not rightly test it, that he boiled it down till it ate a chicken feather clean and called it ready, and that his father had done it that way before him. She looked at the road ahead and said, mild as milk, that a feather would tell him the lye was strong, but not how strong, and that there was all the difference in the world between the 2. And Emmett Rourke did not answer that, but something moved behind his tired face, a flicker of irritation, and under the irritation, a flicker of something else he was too worn down to name. And they rode the last mile in a silence that had a different weight in it than the silence before. The Rourke place stood up out of the cottonwoods where the road turned, and it should have been a fine little holding, and instead it was a wound. There was a low log house with a good stone chimney and a roof of shakes gone gray, a rendering shed with a wide iron kettle sunk in a fire pit, and the fire banked low under it, a long open-sided works shed hung with drying candle rods and stacked with wooden soap frames, 3 tall ash hoppers built up on stone legs, and a scatter of pole pens down toward the creek, where a dozen gaunt cattle stood, and beyond it all the green benches ran up toward the snow, and it was a place a man ought to have been proud to bring a new woman home to. And instead, Emmett Rourke drove up to it the way a man comes home to a house with sickness in the walls. A small girl came around the corner of the rendering shed. She was slight for 7, brown as a hazelnut, in a dress let out twice at the hem and a pair of boots gone over at the heel. And she stopped when she saw the stranger on the wagon seat and put her back flat against the shed wall the way a barn cat goes flat, watching, not coming and not running. And Adeline did not go to her. She had helped raise a dead sister's children and buried her own hope of any. and she knew better than to go at a wary child head-on. She climbed down off the buckboard by herself and stood a moment settling her skirts and let the girl look at her, and she looked once, without seeming to, at the child's thin wrists and the careful blankness of her small face, and she filed it away. Emmett Rourke lifted the trunk down and set it on the porch step, and he said the girl was Posey, that she had been Ruth's sister's child and was left an orphan the same bad winter that took Ruth herself, so that he had buried a wife and taken in a baby in the space of a month, and that Posey did not talk much to strangers and there was no use forcing her. He said it flat, the way he said everything. And then he stood there with his hat in his hands looking at the child and at the woman and at the smoking kettle, as if he could not for the life of him think what came next. An old man came out of the work shed, wiping his hands on a sacking apron, bandy-legged and dried out, near 60, with a white mustache stained yellow and knuckles swollen to knots with the rheumatism. And this was Alton Frame, who had worked for Emmett's father before him, and had stayed on for wages that had not been paid in cash money in a year. And it was Alton who had written the letter, and Adeline saw at once from the shrewd kind way he looked her over that he had wanted her there long before Emmett did. Alton said she was welcome, and he said it like he meant it, and he looked at the heavy trunk and then at her steady eyes, and something in his weathered face said he had already guessed there was more to her than the agency paper claimed. Adeline thanked him. She took off her gloves and her bonnet and laid them on the trunk, and she rolled her sleeves to the elbow. And then, before she had so much as seen the inside of the house, before she had been shown a bed or offered a cup of water, she walked past all three of them across the yard to the rendering shed and stood over the sunk kettle and looked down into it at the yellow tallow simmering there. And she took up the long wooden paddle leaned against the stones and skimmed a little of the scum off the top, and smelled it and rubbed it between two fingers, and her mouth tightened, and she said, to nobody in particular, that the fat was scorching against the bottom because the fire was too hot and the water too low, and that scorched fat was half of why his soap came out the color of weak coffee and smelled the way it smelled, and that any soap boiled on tallow rendered like this would never be worth a nickel a bar, no matter how good the lie. And Emmett Rourke stood in the door of his own works with his hat in his hands and looked at the widow he had sent for turning his ruin over in her two scarred hands not 10 minutes off the wagon. And he did not know whether to be angry or ashamed or something underneath both of those that he had no name for and no strength left to feel. And Alton Frame, behind him, hid a slow smile in his yellow mustache and said nothing at all. The kitchen was a dead room in a house full of dead rooms. She saw it the moment she stepped through the door. Not filthy exactly, but stopped, the way a clock stops. Everything sitting precisely where a woman named Ruth Rourke had set it down 2 years before, and nobody since had found the heart to move it. There was a table that got used by 3 and never once scrubbed to the wood. There was a window over the dry sink so long unwashed that the last of the daylight came through it the color of dishwater. There was a shelf with a woman's things still upon it, a yellow crock with a chip out of the lip turned handle out the way a woman turns a handle when she means to come back for it in a minute, a work basket with a half-hemmed pinafore folded over the rim, a sprig of dried larkspur gone to dust in a bottle. The stove was cold. The child's cot, when she saw it later, had a quilt on it pieced by hands that were gone, worn thin now at the chin where a small body pulled it up in the night. Everything in that house was 2 years old, and had stood exactly where it stood for 2 years, and the man who lived in it walked through all of it every day without once letting his eyes come to rest on any of it. Adeline Pruitt set her bonnet on the table, and she found the wood box, and she built a fire in the cold stove, and put water on to heat, and she did not ask leave. She had learned a long while back that a house that has stopped needs somebody to simply start it going again, and that asking a grieving man's permission only hands him the chance to say no. By full dark she had a fire drawing, and the window over the sink washed clean on the inside so the last gray light came through it honest, and a plain supper on the table, salt pork and beans and pan bread, because that was what the house had, and she made it well because she made everything well. 4 of them sat down to it, the man and the child and old Alton, and the child Posy ate with her eyes on her plate and did not say a word, but Adeline saw her sneak one long look at the clean window and then at the stranger who had cleaned it, and filed that away too. That first night Adeline lay in the little lean-to room off the kitchen that had been meant for a hired girl in better days, and she listened to the house settle around her in the cold, and she did not sleep for a long while, and she thought about the yellow scorched tallow, and the untested lye and the ash hoppers built wrong so that the leach ran too fast, and her hands opened and closed in the dark. Because there was work here. Real work. The exact work she had spent her whole married life learning and had thought she would never touch again, and it was going to waste under a man too beaten down to see it. She had not told Emmett Rourke one true thing about herself, except her name. She had let him believe what the agency paper said and what the whole town believed on the boardwalk. That she was a used-up widow taking the only situation that would have her. And that was true as far as it went. But it was not the half of it. Adeline Pruitt had been the wife for 6 years of a man named Josiah Pruitt, who owned a soap and candle manufactory in Cincinnati, a real works with steam kettles and frame rooms and a crew of 40, and she had not been the kind of manufactory wife who kept to the parlor. Her own father had been a tallow chandler before Josiah, and she had grown up to her elbows in fat and ash and potash, and when she married into the Pruitt works she had gone straight down onto the floor and learned every step of the finer trade, the boiling and the salting out and the graining, the settling of the neat soap, the perfuming and the milling and the pressing of the hard white toilet bars that sold for 2 bits apiece in the good shops back east, while Frontier soft soap went for pennies a firkin. She had a nose and a hand for it that the old German master boiler Josiah kept had said, in front of the whole crew, was better than his own, that the girl could tell the strength of a lie by the taste of 1 drop on her tongue closer than he could tell it with his hydrometer, and that it was a sinful waste she had been born a woman and not a soap boiler's son. And then Josiah had died of a burst appendix in the space of 3 days, and his younger brother Wendell, who had never so much as skimmed a kettle, had produced a will nobody had seen before, and lawyers Adeline could not outpay, and inside of a year she had been eased out of the works her own hands had helped build, given a small settlement to go quietly, and left a widow at 28 with a head full of a master's trade and no floor to stand on. She had taken that settlement, most of it in gold coin because she trusted no bank Wendell Pruitt could reach, and she had sewn it into the lining of a trunk, and she had read a torn newspaper by lamplight in a boarding house and seen an advertisement for a chandler on Ute Creek in the Colorado high country who wanted hands to boil his lye, and something she had buried turned over hard in her chest. She had not come west to keep a house. She had come because a man who owned kettles and hoppers and tallow and a trade did not know how to make his soap worth selling, and she did. And she had known it from the smell on the road, and she had known it for a certainty the moment she skimmed that scorched fat, and she meant to build with her own 2 hands the thing that had been taken from her. But she was a woman, and she was new, and she had learned in her hard years that a thing shown too soon is a thing taken away. So she said nothing of any of it. And she cooked, and she cleaned, and she watched, and she waited for Emmett Rourke to run out of reasons to say no. It did not take long for her to see the whole shape of his ruin, because Alton Frame told her most of it inside the first week, out at the ash hoppers where Emmett could not hear, in the grumbling, confiding way of an old man who has carried a worry alone too long. The Rourke place was mortgaged to the roof beam, and the paper was not held by the bank, or not truly. 3 years back, a killing winter had wiped out half the herd Emmett's father had built, and Emmett had borrowed $1,100 to carry the works through and buy tallow to keep the kettles going. And he had borrowed it from Cyrus Merrow, who kept the mercantile and the freight contract and half the paper in Cavell. And the note had grown with interest to better than $1,400 now, and fell due the first day of October. And after that, unless a miracle walked up the creek road, the whole holding, the land and the house and the works and the kettles, would belong to Cyrus Merrow. And there was worse in it than a note, Alton said, dropping his voice though there was nobody to hear. Cyrus Merrow was the only buyer of tallow and the only seller of potash and hauling in 40 miles. And Merrow bought Emmett's rendered tallow at his own price and sold him the barreled potash lye at his own price and weighed both on his own scales in his own back room. And Alton had come to believe over 2 years of watching that those scales were crooked, that Merrow was buying heavy and selling light, shorting a beaten man a little on every transaction, bleeding the works a nickel and a dime at a time so that Emmett could never quite get ahead no matter how hard he and the old man worked. And on top of that, Merrow held the supply. For Merrow's freight wagons hauled the soap and candles the little works did manage to make up to the mining camp at Silverthread and to the new hotel going up in Cavell. And Merrow took his cut coming and going. And lately, Merrow had let it be known around the camp that Rourke soap was harsh caustic stuff that took the hide off a man, which was half true because of the scorched fat and the guessed at lie. And Merrow said it regretfully, as a friend, while quietly arranging to bring in cheaper Eastern soap on his own wagons to sell at a profit once the Rourke works finally went under and the last competition was gone. He was not waiting to foreclose because he was patient. He was waiting because he already knew how it ended. And he meant to own the kettles and the contract both. Adeline listened to all of it standing over an ash hopper with a dipper of weak brown lye in her hand, and she did not despair, because Adeline Pruitt did not despair over things she intended to fix, but her jaw set hard, and she asked Alton Frame one question, which was whether the mining company at Silverthread and the man building the hotel bought their soap and candles through Merrow because they wanted to, or because Merrow was the only man hauling. And Alton looked at her a moment and said, slow, that he supposed it was because Merrow was the only man hauling, and that the mining company had 400 men in its bunkhouses who went through soap and candles by the crate, and the hotel man, a Denver fellow named Josephus Lund, was fitting out 30 rooms and meant to run the finest house between Denver and the Divide, and had said openly he wanted goods a cut above the rough frontier truck, and that both of them took what Merrow brought because Merrow was what there was. And Adeline Pruitt looked up the green benches toward the snow and said, half to herself, that a man who is the only road is only the only road until somebody builds another one. And Alton Frame did not know quite what she meant by that. But he saw the look on her face, and for the first time in 2 years the old man felt something in his chest that he was afraid to call hope. Emmett laid the terms out to her that same first week, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands after the child was abed, and he laid them out flat, the way an honest man lays out a thing he is ashamed of. He said she would keep the lean-to room that had been the hired girl's, and that he would keep his own, and that was how it would stay. And he wanted that understood plain so there was no mistaking why he had sent for her. He said the wage was to have been $10 a month and found, the way Alton had written it, but that he would be honest with her. There was no $10. There was no $2. There had not been cash money on the place in a year, and what he could offer her was a roof and her keep and the child to mind and hard work with likely nothing at the end of it, because the note fell due the 1st of October, and after that there would very likely be no roof either. He said she could take the train back down to Denver come Thursday, and he would scrape the fare together somehow and not think one hair the worse of her, having brought her out under false colors. Then he stopped and looked at his stained hands and said the child's name was Posey and that she had not been right since her aunt died, that she woke crying some nights and would not say why, and that he would understand if a woman did not want to take on a child that was that much sorrow. Adeline listened to the whole of it without moving, and when he was done, she asked him one question, which was how many pounds of tallow he could render in a season if the kettle were run right. He looked up, startled, because it was not a question a housekeeper asks, and he said slow, that between his own beef and the fat he bought off the 2 other outfits in the park and the awful Merrow's butcher threw out, maybe 6,000 or 7,000 pounds across a summer, if he could keep the fires going. But that it did not signify because Merrow paid him 3 cents a pound for the rough soap it made, and there was no getting above it. And Adeline Pruitt said that 7,000 pounds of tallow was somewhere near 4,000 pounds of good hard soap, and that good hard milled toilet soap sold back east at 15 and 20 cents the bar, and there was no earthly reason it would not sell for a dime out here to 400 mining men and a hotel man who wanted a cut above the rough truck, and that a dime a bar on 4,000 pounds was a number that cleared a $1,400 note and left a man his ranch and a good deal besides, and she said all of it in the same level, unhurried voice she said everything in. And then she wished him good night and went into the lean-to room and left Emmett Rourke standing in his own kitchen with his mouth open, because in a week nobody on that place had heard her string that many words together, and not one of them had known that the widow he had sent for to stir his lie could reckon the whole future of his works to the penny in her head. She did not say she would stay. She simply was there in the morning before light with the stove going and the coffee made, and she went out to the rendering shed while the dew was still on the grass, and she began, without asking, to fix the thing that was wrong. She did not tear the works apart in a day, because she had learned that a proud man will forgive you a great deal if you let him think he came to it himself, and she went carefully. She started with the fire. She raked the roaring blaze down under the tallow kettle to a low, even bed of coals, and banked it with ash, and she carried up buckets of Cold Creek water and let the fat down slow, and she showed Emmett, not telling him but doing it beside him so he could see, how tallow rendered gentle over a slack fire came out pale gold and sweet instead of brown and scorched, and how you skimmed it and strained it through a cloth and let it settle and drew off the clean fat clear as lamp oil from the cracklings and the dirt below. Emmett Rourke watched her draw off that first clean batch and rub a little between his cracked fingers and smell it, and he did not say anything. But that evening he raked his own fire down without being told, and Adeline saw him do it and said nothing either, and that was how they went on. She rebuilt the ash hoppers next. She had seen at a glance that they leached too fast, that the ash sat too loose, and the water ran straight through and came out the color of weak tea and half as strong as it ought to be, and she packed them properly, a bed of straw and then the hardwood ashes tamped down firm in layers, and she ran soft rainwater through slow, a bucket set to drip through overnight, and what came off the bottom the next morning was lye the color of dark amber, and strong enough to float a fresh egg with just the top of the shell showing, which was the old way of telling, and stronger than that she tested with a thing she took from her trunk that made Emmett Rourke's eyebrows go up. A slender glass float in a little brass case. A hydrometer, which she set gently in a jar of the cooled lye and read the mark where it swam like a woman reading scripture. He asked her, careful, where a hired housekeeper came by a brine glass and how she knew the reading of it, and Adeline said, level, that she had kept house for a soap man once, back east, and picked up his tricks. And Emmett Rourke looked at her a long moment and did not press it, but she saw him tuck the answer away as a thing that did not quite sit flush, and she knew she would not be able to hold the whole truth back much longer. The first true batch of soap they boiled together the 2nd week of June, and it was the day the works turned. Though none of them knew it yet. She built the fire slow and let the clean tallow melt in the great kettle and fed in her amber lie a dipperful at a time, stirring, reading the change in the way the fat and the lye came together and thickened and turned. That slow magic she had watched 100 times and never tired of. The two thin things becoming one thick thing. And she talked while she did it, not to Emmett and not to Alton, but out into the air of the shed, naming what she did as she did it the way her old master had named it for her, so that the words fell where anybody standing near might pick them up. She salted the boiled soap and let it grain and rise, the pure neat soap floating up clean and leaving the spent lye and the dirt in the liquor below. And she drew off the good soap and boiled it a second time smooth and let it settle a day. And when she cut into the frames the next morning, what came out was not the weak brown grease Emmett Rourke had been selling for 3 cents a pound. It was firm and pale and close-grained, and it smelled of nothing at all, which is to say it smelled clean. And when she washed her scarred hands with a corner of it at the creek, it lathered white and rinsed away without a bite. And Emmett Rourke washed his own ruined hands with it and stood there looking at them. At the caustic cracked knuckles he had lived with so long he had stopped feeling them, going soft in that lather, and he did not say one word. But the child, Posy, who had drifted closer day by day the way the barn cat had, watched him wash his hands and then held out her own small ones without a word, and Adeline crouched and washed the child's hands in the creek with the new soap, gently, one finger at a time, and Posy watched her do it with her whole grave face, and that evening, for the first time, the little girl carried the water bucket in for Adeline without being asked. That was the beginning of the child. Posy came to her before the man did, the way the wary ones do, sideways and slow. She took to sitting on an upturned frame in the work shed in the long evenings, at a careful distance, watching Adeline stir and skim and cut. And she never said anything, and Adeline never made her. And then one evening Adeline simply began to talk. Not to the child and not to the soap, but out into the warm air between them, telling the story of the first batch of soap she had ever ruined as a girl. How she had let the lye go too strong and boiled up a kettle of stuff so harsh it took the shine off a copper penny, and how her father had not scolded her, but had made her stand and watch him fix it, and how she had learned more from the ruining and the fixing than from 100 good batches after. And the child listened to the whole of it without moving. And when it was done, she was quiet a while, and then she said, in a small rusty voice like a gate that has not been opened in a long time, that her Aunt Ruth used to tell her stories at night. It was the first whole sentence Adeline had heard out of her. She did not make a fuss of it. She said she would wager Ruth told good ones, and Posy said she did, that she told about a princess in a wood, and that she could not remember how it ended, and something in the way the child said it, the small, held in grief of a story with no ending, went straight into Adeline Pruitt like a splinter. She said that she knew a story about a princess in a wood, and that she would tell Posey the end of it that night if she liked. And she made one up, walking the child to her cot. A plain good ending, where the princess came out of the wood into the sun, and Posey fell asleep on it. And after that, the child was Adeline's shadow, carrying and fetching and holding the ends of things, talking now in the steady stream of a stopped-up child once the plug is drawn. And Emmett Rourke would come in at noon and find his silent little niece chattering to the housekeeper about soap and lye and princesses, and he would stand in the door with something aching behind his ribs and not know what to do with his face. The soap sold. That was the thing that changed everything and the thing that started the trouble, both at once. Adeline did not send the first good batch up to Silverthread on Merrow's wagon at Merrow's price. She wrapped a dozen of the pale hard bars in clean paper and had Alton drive her and Posey down to Cavell on a Saturday when the mining men came in for their pay and their pleasures, and she did not take a stall or ask Merrow's leave. She simply stood at the tail of the buckboard at the low end of the street with the soap laid out on a clean cloth and a basin of creek water beside it. And she washed her own hands in front of God and everybody and held out a wet, white bar to any man who slowed down to look, and let him feel for himself the difference between that and the brown lye soap that took his hide off in the bunkhouse. She did not say a word against Merrow. She did not need to. A soap that lathers clean and does not burn sells itself to a man who has washed with the other kind all winter, and by noon she had sold every bar she brought at 10 cents apiece, a whole $1.20 in hard coin laid in her palm, more clean cash than the Rourke Works had seen in a single day in 2 years. And 3 mining men had asked where they could get more, and a big Cornish shift boss named Trevanion had bought 2 bars and said he would take a whole crate for his bunkhouse if she could make it, and the word of it ran up and down that street before the wagon was loaded to go home. Cyrus Merrow came out onto the boardwalk in front of his mercantile as they were leaving, in a good gray coat with a watch chain across his vest, and he was the most pleasant man in Cavell. He was near 50, smooth-shaven and heavy through the jaw, with small, careful eyes and a voice like warm oil, and he came down the steps and took his hat off to Adeline, a housekeeper, which most men in his place would not have troubled to do, and he said he had heard there was help out at the Rourke place now, and that it did his heart good. That a motherless child and a grieving man was a hard thing, and the valley had worried over them. He said all of it warmly, and he seemed to mean every word, and his small eyes went over the empty cloth and the coins in her hand, and the 3 mining men still lingering, and Adeline watched him count it all and price it all behind that pleasant face, and she understood the man completely inside of a minute. He came to his point gently, the way a cat comes to a bird. He said he was glad to see her enterprise, truly, but that she wanted to be careful, that the mining company and the hotel took their goods through his freight by long custom, and it would not do to go stirring up the camp. That a woman new to the country could not know how easily a thing like that was misunderstood, and that in any case Emmett owed him money, a good deal of money, and that everything the Rourke Works produced was rightly spoken for against that debt, and he said it all smiling, as a friend giving hard-won advice. And then he said, looking at her kindly, that he understood Rourke had got himself a strong widow woman off the train, and that it was a sensible thing, a good sturdy widow being worth 2 hired girls and not expecting much, since they were used to work and used to disappointment both, and he said it straight to her face with a smile of real friendliness, as though he had paid her a compliment and expected to be thanked. Adeline thanked him. She said it was kind of him to trouble himself over their little doings, in a voice as smooth and warm as fresh cream, and she smiled while she said it, and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Cyrus Merrow smiled back, and had not the first idea that he had just been measured, weighed on a truer scale than any in his back room, and filed away by the one person in that valley he had entirely failed to take account of. They drove home up the creek road with the coins knotted in a handkerchief in Adeline's pocket and Posey asleep against her side, and Alton Frame said, after a mile, that Merrow would not stand for it, that he had run off 2 other men who tried to sell around his freight, and Adeline said, watching the snow go pink on the peaks ahead, that she was counting on Merrow not standing for it, because a man who cannot stand to be gone around is a man who will make a mistake trying to close the road, and that all she needed was for him to make it in front of the right eyes. Alton did not fully understand that either, but he was beginning to learn that when the widow said a thing that sounded like riddling, it was worth remembering, because it generally came true. June went into July, and the works came alive. Adeline had Emmett and Alton building while she boiled, a proper settling trough, a rack of new frames, a milling table where the cured soap could be shaved into ribbons and worked and pressed, because plain hard soap was well enough for the bunkhouses, but she was already reaching past it toward the thing that would carry them, the fine milled toilet soap that sold for real money to people who wanted more than clean. And here she brought out the second half of what she had carried west. Not the gold sewn in the trunk lining, not yet, but the knowledge, the perfuming and the milling that no chandler in 40 miles could touch. And she began to teach herself the country the way she had once known the city, walking the benches with Posey in the early mornings, gathering what grew, wild bergamot and the blue spikes of larkspur, and the resinous tips of the spruce, and the sweet inner bark of a certain shrub, learning by nose and by trial what would hold its scent through the lye and what would die in it, rendering little test batches no bigger than a teacup, keeping a book of them in a small hand. By the middle of July she had 3 soaps the like of which had never been made in that country, a plain white bunkhouse bar, hard as a stone, and clean as water, a green spruce scented bar that smelled of the high woods after rain, and a pale rose-brown bar worked with wild bergamot and a little rendered beeswax that lathered like cream and left the skin soft, and this last one she wrapped in squares of paper she cut and folded herself, and it was as fine a toilet soap as anything Adeline Pruitt had ever pressed on the Cincinnati floor, and she knew it. And the knowing of it lit something in her that had been dark since Josiah died. Emmett Rourke came to the works one evening and found her at the milling table with her sleeves rolled and her hands full of pale ribboned soap, and the whole shed smelling of bergamot and spruce, and Posey beside her folding papers with her small tongue between her teeth, and the low sun coming gold through the open side of the shed. And he stood there a moment not seen, and something happened in his chest that he had been holding off for 2 years. The dangerous opening feeling of a door he had nailed shut coming loose at one corner, and he turned and went back out to the kettle before she saw his face, because he was not ready, and he did not know if he would ever be. The trust between the man and the woman was not built in a look, though. It was built one bad night in the 3rd week of July, and it was built the way real things are built, out of a shared disaster. They had a great boiling going, the biggest batch yet, near 400 pounds of soap in the kettle for Trevanian's bunkhouse crate and 2 more the camp had ordered, and it was late and the fire was high, and Emmett was tending it while Adeline read the graining, when a green cottonwood log popped in the fire pit and threw a coal, and the coal lit the sacking apron Emmett had hung too near, and in the space of 3 breaths there was fire licking up the shed post toward the drying rack hung with the season's candles. All that tallow ready to go up like a torch, and the whole works with it. Emmett went for it with his bare hands and a bucket, and would have been badly burned or worse. But Adeline Pruitt did not run for water. She seized the wet settling blanket out of the cooling trough, sopping with cold soap liquor, and threw it up over the burning post and smothered the flame against the wood and held it there with the whole weight of her body while the steam scalded her wrists. And it was out in a moment that could have been the end of everything. And the 2 of them stood in the sudden dark and the reek of wet char breathing hard, and Emmett Rourke looked at her holding her scalded wrists against her apron, at the woman who had not run and had not screamed, and had known in one instant the one thing in that shed that would smother a tallow fire. And he understood, standing there, that she was not what she had told him she was, and that whatever she was, she had just saved his works and very likely his life without a wasted motion. And he did not say any of that. He said low that her wrists wanted tending, and she said they would keep. And he said no, they would not. And he sat her down on the frame and went and got the pale rose soap and a bowl of cool creek water and washed the scald himself, clumsy, careful, his cracked hands gentle on her scalded ones, and neither of them said a word. And the fire ticked and cooled in the pit, and something passed between them in the dark of that shed that neither of them had any language for, and neither of them tried to find any. And after a while Posey's small voice came from the house doorway asking was everything all right, and the moment folded itself away, but it did not go anywhere. It stayed in the shed with them the rest of that summer, banked like a coal under ash. Cyrus Merrow made his first hard move the last day of July, and he made it, as Adeline had known he would, by trying to close the road. Emmett drove down to Cavell for potash and barreled lye, the one thing the works could not make for itself in quantity, and Merrow's clerk, a narrow sour man named Dobbs Skeen, told him at the counter that the store was out of potash and did not know when more would come, and that the freight was full for the season and could not haul Rourke goods up to Silverthread after all. Mr. Merrow's regrets, and that if Emmett wanted to settle accounts early, Mr. Merrow would be pleased to take the works off his hands at a fair figure and save everyone the unpleasantness of October. Emmett came home gray in the face and told it at the supper table with his hands flat on the wood that Merrow had cut off the lye and cut off the wagons both, that a man could make all the fine soap in the world and it did not signify if he could not get potash to boil it or wagons to haul it, and that maybe the only sane thing left was to take Merrow's figure and go, before they lost even the fare out. And Adeline Pruitt set down the coffee pot and turned around and said the first truly hard thing she had said to him, which was that he had a shed full of the finest soap in the territory and a woman in his kitchen who had made it, and that if he sold to Cyrus Merrow in August, she would think him not a beaten man but a coward. And she said it level and plain, and looked him in the eye, and Emmett Rourke, who had not been spoken to like that since his father died, opened his mouth and shut it. And then, for the first time in 2 years, he laughed, one short surprised bark of a laugh, and said, "All right then," but she had best tell him where a man got potash if not from Merrow, and how a man hauled 40 miles if not on Merrow's wagons, because he surely did not know. And Adeline said that a man made his own lye, which they were already doing, and burned his own hardwood ash for the potash he could not buy, which meant cutting and burning cordwood by the rick, hard work but free, and that as for the hauling, they would buy their own wagon. And when Emmett said with what there being no money, Adeline Pruitt was quiet a moment, and then she made the decision she had been circling since Cincinnati. And she got up and went into the lean-to room and came back with a small, heavy chamois bag, and she set it on the table between them and opened the neck of it, and gold coins spilled out into the lamplight. More hard money than Emmett Rourke or Alton Frame or the child had seen in one place in their lives. Near $300 in double eagles, and the kitchen went very still. And then Adeline Pruitt told them the truth. All of it, in her level, unhurried voice, because the time for holding it had run out and she had chosen the moment herself rather than have it dragged from her, and telling it on her own terms was the last free thing she owned. She told them about Josiah and the Cincinnati Works and the 40-man crew, and the boiling and the milling and the perfuming she had learned to a master's hand, and the old German boiler who had said she had a better nose than his own. She told them about the burst appendix and the 3 days and the will nobody had seen, and Wendell Pruitt and the lawyers she could not outpay, and the small settlement she had taken in gold because she trusted no bank her husband's brother could reach, and how she had been put out of the works her own hands had built and left a widow at 28 with a master's trade and no floor to stand on. She said she had not answered Emmett's advertisement to keep house. She had answered it because a man on U Creek owned kettles and tallow and a trade and did not know how to make his soap worth a nickel. And she did. And she had meant from the first day to build here the thing that had been stolen from her back east. And she had held her tongue because a thing shown too soon is a thing taken away, and she had had one works taken from her already and did not mean to lose a second. And she pushed the gold a little across the table toward Emmett and said it was not a gift and not charity, that she wanted no man's pity and would give none of his, and that she was proposing a partnership, her money and her trade against his land and his kettles and his name, share and share, and that with $300 they could buy a wagon and a team and cut their own ash and boil their own lye and haul their own soap up to Silverthread over Merrow's Head and be beholden to that man for exactly nothing, and beat him and clear the note and keep the ranch, and that she had the whole of it worked out and had had it worked out for weeks, and the only thing she had been waiting on was to see whether Emmett Rourke had the spine to reach for it, or would sell out cheap the first time a smiling man cut off his lie. Emmett Rourke sat and looked at the gold on his table and at the woman across it for a long moment, and the beaten gray look went out of his face by degrees, and he did not touch the money. He said, at last, low, that he could not take a widow's settlement to save his own hide, that it was the last thing her dead husband left her, and it was not right. And Adeline said that Josiah Pruitt had left her a trade worth 10 times that gold, and that the gold was only the tool of the trade, and that the wrong thing, the truly wrong thing, would be to let it lie sewn in a trunk lining out of pride, while a good works and a good man and a good child went down the creek to a thief, and that she had not crossed 1,000 miles to keep her money safe. She had crossed it to put her money to work, and that he could either be her partner or he could be the situation she left behind, but he could not be her charity because she was not offering any. And Emmett Rourke looked at her, really looked, the way he had looked the night of the fire, and this time he did not turn away from it, and he put out his cracked hand across the table, over the gold, and he said, "All right, partners." And Adeline Pruitt took it and shook it once, firm, the grip of a woman who had done work, and the bargain was made, and old Alton Frame in the corner blew his nose hard into a rag and blamed it on the char smoke, and the child asleep in the next room did not wake, and the lamp burned down, and the whole future of the Rourke Works turned over that night on a kitchen table under a heap of gold coin. And Cyrus Merrow, 40 miles down the valley, slept sound in his bed with no idea at all that the road he thought he had just closed had that very hour been thrown open wider than he had ever dreamed. August was the making of them. They bought a stout second-hand freight wagon and a team of 2 big mules off a broke teamster down at Cavell for $110 in gold, dealing straight and paying cash so that no note and no scale of Merrows touched the bargain. And they cut cordwood by the rick up on the benches and burned it slow in a covered pit for the hard gray potash ash. And Adeline leached her own strong lye by the barrel, and the works ran now from dark to dark, 3 of them and the child, and the smell that came off the Rourke place changed from the rank yellow reek of scorched grease to the clean sharp smell of good soap and spruce and bergamot that a rider on the creek road could catch half a mile off. And a man who knew that country could tell, just from the smell on the wind, that something up Ute Creek had come alive again. Adeline drove the first load up to Silverthread herself, with Emmett riding alongside and Posey on the seat. 4 crates of hard bunkhouse soap and 2 of candles dipped even and true. 40 miles up the switchbacks to the raw board camp, where 400 men dug silver out of the mountain, and she did not go to the company store, which Merrow supplied. She went straight to the shift boss Trevanion and the big Cornish and Welsh miners who had felt her soap on their own hands down in Cavell. And she sold to the men direct at a fair price, a dime a bar and no shorting, and washed hands at the trough and let the goods sell themselves. And inside of 2 hours, she had sold out both wagons and taken standing orders for more than the works could make in a month. And the company clerk came out to see what the commotion was and ended by ordering 10 crates a month for the company account over Merrow's freight entirely, because his men were threatening to riot for the soap that did not take their hide off, and it was cheaper to give them what they wanted than to fight them. And Adeline Pruitt drove home down the mountain in the dusk with a wagon empty of soap and a pocket heavy with coin, and the whole thing proven, the road built, the thing that could not be done, and Emmett Rourke rode beside her the whole way, not talking, the way he did. But every little while he looked over at her against the last light, and this time he did not tuck it away and did not turn from it. They spoke the truest words that had passed between them on the porch that same night, after the child was down and the mules were fed and the coins counted. And it was Emmett who started it, and he started it badly, the way honest men say the truest things. He said he had married Ruth when they were both young and known her since they were children, and buried her, and thought that was the end of that part of a man, and that he had written off for a pair of hands and nothing else on God's earth, and that he wanted to be straight with her the way she had been straight with him with the gold on the table. He said the straight of it was that he did not rightly know any more whether he was fighting to keep the works for Posey's sake, or because he could not stand the thought of her getting on the train in October and going back down to Denver, and that he had no right to say a thing like that to a woman he had brought out under false colors and made his business partner and could not yet pay $1. And he was sorry for it, and he would understand if it made her want the bargain kept strictly to business. He said he was still grieving Ruth, that he did not know how a man stopped, that some mornings he forgot for an hour and then remembered, and the forgetting felt like a betrayal, and that he wanted to be honest about that too, that he was not a whole man offering her a whole thing. He was a patched one, and she deserved to know it. Adeline Pruitt stood at the porch rail with her back half to him and looked at the dark shapes of the benches against the stars for a while, and then she turned around, and she did not smile, and she did not soften. She just looked at him level and plain. She said that he had spent a good deal of breath just then telling her all the reasons he had no right to say a thing, and asked him whether that was the thing he had actually meant to say. And Emmett Rourke stood up off the rail, and he said no, that the thing he meant to say was that he did not want her to go. And Adeline said that was better, and that he might have started there. She said she was still grieving Josiah too, in her own way, that grief was not a debt you paid off and were done. It was a thing you learned to carry alongside the living, and that she had not come west to replace one man with another and would not insult either of them by pretending otherwise. She said she had come to build, and that somewhere along the way, between the fire and the gold and the road up to Silverthread, building beside him had stopped feeling like a bargain and started feeling like a life, and that she was not a girl and would not talk around a thing, so she would say it plain. That when she thought of the train in October now, she did not think of Denver. She thought of the works and the child and the man on the porch, and that she was in no hurry, and neither should he be, but that he could stop apologizing for wanting her, because it was not an insult to a woman to be wanted by a good man who said it honest. It was about the only clean thing left in the whole business. And she said they would talk about the rest of it after there was a ranch to talk about it on, because there was a note due the 1st of October and a thief in Cavell who had not yet made his real move, and she was not going to let either of them be distracted into losing the thing they had built for the sake of saying too soon what could just as well be said in November, on a porch that belonged to them, free and clear. And Emmett Rourke laughed his short, surprised laugh again, and said that she was the most practical woman God ever made, and that he was half in love with her practicality alone, and Adeline said the other half would keep, and sent him to bed, and Emmett Rourke slept that night the whole way through for the first time in 3 years. Cyrus Merrow made his real move in the second week of September, when he understood at last that cutting off the lie and the wagons had not killed the Rourke works, but had somehow made it stronger. That Rourke soap was now in every bunkhouse at Silverthread, and the company was buying it direct, and his own Eastern soap was sitting unsold in his storeroom, and the whole camp was laughing at the caustic truck he had tried to pass off, and a man like Merrow could forgive a great many things but not being laughed at, and not losing money, and he set out to do both at once and to do it with the law on his side. He rode out to the Rourke place himself on his tall black horse in his good gray coat, pleasant as ever on the surface, but with the small eyes gone flat and cold. And he sat his horse in the yard and did not get down, and he told Emmett that he had come as a courtesy, that he held the note, and the note fell due the 1st of October. $1,430 now with the interest, in full, in coin, on the day, and that he would not be carrying it 1 hour past due, nor taking soap nor stock nor promises in place of cash. Coin on the barrelhead the 1st of October, or the sheriff would put the Rourke family off the land on the 2nd, and that he thought it only Christian to give a man fair warning so the child would not be turned out cold without time to pack. And then he looked at Adeline standing in the work store with her sleeves rolled and soap on her hands, and he smiled his oiled smile. And he said he had heard the widow was quite the little soap maker, and that it was a pity all that industry would come to nothing, and that a sensible woman would take the fare he would generously provide and go back east before the snow, rather than tie herself to a foreclosed man and his orphan. And he tipped his hat to her, kindly, as though he had done her a favor. And he turned the black horse and rode out, and the dust of him hung in the road, and then the wind took it. And Emmett Rourke stood in the yard with his fists shut, because $1,430 in coin by the 1st of October was a wall he could not see over even now, even with the soap selling, because it took time to turn tallow into money, and there were not enough days left before the note, and Merrow had timed it to the hour, had let them build just enough to break their hearts and not enough to clear the debt. And Emmett said so, low and bitter, that they would be 40 rich in 6 months, and were 40 short in 3 weeks, and that Merrow had known it to the day. But Adeline Pruitt was not looking at the dust. She was looking past it, down the valley toward Cavell, and she was thinking, following the thing the way she followed the graining of a batch, all the way down to where it lived. And she asked Emmett one question, which was whether it was true what she had heard, that the new hotel in Cavell, the Denver Man Lund's Grand, was to open the last week of September, with a great opening day. A dinner and a dance, and every soul in the county invited, and buyers and drummers come up from Denver on the cars. And Emmett said it was true, that Lund had spared no expense and meant to make it the event of the year and put Cavell on the map, and that the whole valley would be there, and Merrow foremost, because Merrow had the contract to supply the hotel and meant to preen over it. And Adeline Pruitt went very still, and then she said, slow, that if the whole valley was to be in one place on one day, with buyers down from Denver and the hotel man wanting goods a cut above the rough truck, and Cyrus Merrow standing there fat and proud with his short, weighted Eastern soap laid out as the finest in the county, then that was not a disaster. That was a stage. And a stage, she said, was exactly the thing she had been waiting for since the afternoon Cyrus Merrow sat his horse in her yard and called her a sensible widow who ought to go home. Because a man who tells a woman to her face that all her industry will come to nothing has told her everything about how his mind works. And she had known from that hour that his own contempt would be the thing that undid him, and she had only been waiting to see the shape of the trap so she could show him the daylight standing in the middle of it. She laid the plan out on the kitchen table that night, and it was a plain plan and a bold one. And it turned on one thing, that Cyrus Merrow could not resist standing up in front of the whole county as the great supplier of the finest hotel in the mountains, and that a man standing up to be admired is a man standing where everyone can see him fall. She did not mean to go to the hotel opening to beg for a contract or to argue against Merrow, because an argument had two sides, and a beaten widow arguing against the richest man in Cavell would only make him look magnanimous. She meant to bring her soap and let it speak, in daylight, in front of buyers and drummers and every soul in the valley and the hotel man himself, and set it beside Merrow's, and let anyone with 2 hands and a nose judge for himself. Because a lie about goods dies the instant an honest man handles the goods. And Cyrus Merrow had spent a summer telling everyone that Rourke soap was harsh, caustic truck, and she was going to hand a bar of her bergamot toilet soap to the hotel man in front of the crowd Merrow had gathered to admire himself and let the difference do in 1 minute what a season of words could not. First, though, she needed the buyers to be looking, and for that she wrote a letter, in the fine, strong hand of a manufactory man's widow, and she directed it not to the hotel keeper Lund, but to the 2 Denver soap and dry goods drummers she knew would ride up on the cars for the opening, whose houses she knew by name from her Cincinnati years, and she wrote, as one of the trade, telling them plainly that there was a new works on Ute Creek turning out milled toilet soap of Eastern grade at frontier prices, and that if they wanted a sample and a supplier before their rivals found it, they would do well to be at the Cavell Grand on opening day and ask to see the Rourke soap. And she signed it with her own name, Adeline Pruitt, late of the Pruitt Works of Cincinnati, and one of those drummers had bought Pruitt soap by the gross for a decade and knew exactly what that name on a letter meant. And he came up on the cars, and he brought the other. The Cavell Grand Hotel opened on the 28th of September under a hard, clean blue sky. 3 stories of new milled lumber and glass with bunting along the gallery and a brass band down from Denver, and every wagon in the county drawn up along the street, and there were long tables set out under the cottonwoods with the goods of the valley laid out for the buyers to see, wool and hides and vegetables, and Cyrus Merrow's whole proud display of freighted Eastern goods, with his best soap stacked up in a pyramid and a hand-lettered card that said supplied to the Cavell Grand by sea. Merrow and Merrow himself stood beside it in a new coat with his thumbs in his vest, holding court, telling the Denver drummers and the hotel man Lund and anyone who would listen about the quality he brought over the mountains at such expense for the discerning trade. And into that at the hour Adeline had chosen, when the crowd was thickest and the buyers were out among the tables and the band had paused, the Rourke wagon came up the street, washed and its team brushed, and Adeline Pruitt got down from it, in her one good dark dress, with her scarred hands clean, and Emmett Rourke beside her in a clean shirt, and the child Posey between them, and old Alton carrying a small table, and they did not go near Merrow's pyramid. They set their own small table under the other cottonwood with a clean white cloth and a basin of clear water, and they laid out 3 neat stacks of soap, the hard white and the green spruce, and the pale bergamot bars in their folded papers, no card, no boast, and Adeline simply began to wash her hands in the basin, unhurried, in front of everybody, the way she had at the tail of the wagon on that first Saturday, and the smell of bergamot went out on the air, and one by one, the curious drifted over. Cyrus Merrow saw them come, and his face worked to stay pleasant, and he came across the grass with his oiled voice raised loud enough to carry, and he said he was grieved to see poor Rourke drag his caustic soap all the way to town on such a day, that it was a hard thing for a man to embarrass himself at a public occasion, and that he had warned everyone the Rourke works turned out lye-burn soap that would take the skin off a lady's hands, and he said it to the crowd, kindly, a good man sparing his neighbors a bad bargain, and 2 or 3 who owed Merrow money nodded along, because it is a comfortable thing to believe the powerful man when he is smiling. And Adeline Pruitt did not answer Cyrus Merrow. That was the hardest thing she had asked of herself and of Emmett both, to stand silent and let the man talk, because a weight has no argument in it, and she did not want to be seen trading words with him. Into that silence, at exactly the moment she had judged, one of the 2 Denver drummers, a stout, shrewd man named Holliday, who had bought Pruitt soap for 10 years, stepped up to her little table and picked up a bar of the bergamot soap, and turned it in the light and read the folded paper, and looked at her and said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, that he would be damned, that this was milled toilet soap of a grade he did not see once a year west of the Missouri. And he asked her in front of Merrow and Lund and the county whether she was the same Adeline Pruitt of the Pruitt Works of Cincinnati whose soap he had bought by the gross for a decade, and Adeline said that she was. And a kind of quiet went over that end of the crowd, and Halliday washed his own hands in her basin, and held them up wet and lathered for the crowd to see and smell, the clean bergamot lather that did not bite, and then he walked 3 steps to Merrow's proud pyramid, and picked up a bar of Merrow's best freighted Eastern soap, and washed his other hand with that, and held both hands up side by side, the one soft and sweet, and the other filmed and harsh, and he said dry to the hotel man Lund, that if the Cavell Grand meant to be the finest house in the mountains it had, better put the Ute Creek soap in its rooms, and not the truck stacked under that card yonder. And the crowd laughed, and it was not a kind laugh for Cyrus Merrow. Merrow's voice climbed then, and that was his ruin, because a smooth man who loses his smoothness in front of a crowd has already lost, and he said, too loud, spreading his hands, appealing to the county man to man, that they should not be taken in by a clever widow and a Denver salesman in league, that he had been the honest supplier of that valley for 15 years while Rourke ran his works into the ground, and that he weighed fair and dealt fair and had the ledgers to prove it. And he said the word ledgers. And Adeline Pruitt, who had said nothing at all for a quarter of an hour, spoke at last, in her level, unhurried voice, and asked Cyrus Merrow, mild as milk, in front of everyone, whether he would care to bring out his scales. She said she had sold that man Merrow rendered tallow for 4 months, and bought his barreled potash for 4 months, weighed on his own scales in his own back room, and that she was a chandler's daughter and a soap-maker's widow, and she knew to the ounce what a barrel of potash weighed, and what a firkin of tallow weighed, and that she had kept her own account of every weight Merrow's scales had given her against every weight her own true balance gave the same goods on the wagon. And she took from her pocket a small worn book and held it up, and she said that Cyrus Merrow's scales bought heavy and sold light by near 1/10 on every transaction, that he had shorted a grieving man a little on every pound of tallow and every pound of potash for 2 years, and that it was all set down here in figures, dates and weights, and that she would be pleased to have the sheriff and Mr. Lund and Mr. Halliday check her true balance against Merrow's scales this very afternoon in front of the county, if Cyrus Merrow was as honest as he claimed. And she laid the little book on the white cloth and put her scarred hand flat on it and looked at Cyrus Merrow and did not say another word. And Cyrus Merrow stood in the hard blue daylight in his new coat with the whole county looking at him, and he could not send for his scales, because his scales were crooked, and he knew it, and now he understood that she knew it and had known it for months, and had the proof of it in figures, and he could not refuse to send for them either, because an honest man with nothing to hide sends for his scales. And every soul on that grass understood in the same breath why he did neither. And the silence that came down on Cyrus Merrow was the silence of a man falling a long way in front of people who had feared him an hour before and did not fear him now. It was over then, though it took a while to finish, the way these things do. The hotel man Josephus Lund, who had not built the finest house in the mountains by being a fool, looked at the 2 soaps and the 2 hands and the little account book and the falling man. And he came to Adeline Pruitt's small table and shook her clean hand and said, loud, that the Cavil Grand would take all the milled toilet soap the Ute Creek Works could make, at a fair price set fair, for every room and every year, and he said it looking at Merrow while he said it. And Halliday the drummer took out his order book on the spot and wrote her a standing order for his Denver house. So many gross a season shipped down on the cars, more soap than the little works could make in a year, which was a good trouble to have, and the making of a bigger works to come. And the Silver Thread Company man, who was there for the opening, added the camp's account to it in the open, glad to deal direct with the maker and be quit of Merrow's freight and Merrow's short weight both. And when the sums of it were reckoned, the standing orders alone, before a single new bar was boiled, were worth more in a year than the Rourke works had earned in the 5 years before. And the note that fell due the 1st of October, the $1,430 in coin that had been a wall 3 weeks before, was cleared that same week, not out of the gold in the trunk, but out of the first true earnings of the works, and an advance against Lund's contract. And Adeline Pruitt made a point of it that Emmett Rourke himself carry the coin into the bank at Cavell and pay the note in full over the counter in front of Dobbs, Skeen, and half the town, and take up the paper on his own land with his own hand, and he did. And he stood a moment on the bank steps after, with the canceled note folded in his shirt, and could not quite make his face behave. As for Cyrus Merrow, a merchant caught short waiting his neighbors in front of the whole county and exposed as a slanderer in the same hour, does not keep his custom long. The mining company took its account elsewhere, and the hotel took its trade to the maker, and the farmers who had weighed on his scales for years began quietly to weigh at home and to talk. And the little worn account book Adeline had kept made the rounds of the valley in copy and in rumor, until every soul who had ever traded at the Merrow Mercantile went back over their own dealings and did not, like the sum. And within the year Cyrus Merrow had sold his interests in Cavell at a loss, and gone down to Denver, and then further. And it was said in that country for a long time after that a man with a crooked scale is only ever one honest woman's account book away from ruin. And mostly when they said it, they meant Merrow. They were married in the last week of October, in the little frame church in Cavell, with the aspens gone gold on the benches above the creek, and the first hard frost silvering the mornings, and half the valley came, because a valley that will talk a woman down when she is losing will turn out in its Sunday best to see her married when she has won. Hesse-Task came, who had stood in the mercantile doorway in the spring and pitied the poor creature off the train. And near the end of it, on the church steps, Hesse-Task said to Adeline, stiff and low, that she had said some things back in May that she had had no business saying, having said them about a stranger she had judged off a train platform, and that she had been wrong about the stranger and wrong to say them, and she hoped Mrs. Rourke would not hold it against a foolish woman. And Adeline Pruitt, who was Adeline Rourke now, and who could have made her say a great deal more and did not, said only that she would be glad of a friend in town, and that she was partial to lavender if Hesse ever wanted to try the new soap. And Hesse-Task laughed a watery laugh and said she would. And that was the end of the pitying. The child Posey stood up with them at that wedding in a new dress with a sprig of the last larkspur pinned to it. And she was not silent any more. She had not been silent in months. And she cried a little for happiness, and was not ashamed of it. And old Alton Frame cried a good deal more, and blamed it on the cold. And that night, back at the works, Posey asked Adeline if she could call her mother now, having only ever had an aunt, and lost her. And Adeline Rourke, who did not weep over things she meant to keep, wept a little over that, and said yes. And that was the truest bargain struck on the whole place that year. The Ute Creek Works did not become the greatest soap house in the West, because that is not what happens to real places, but it became something better, which was a going concern and a known name, and the word that went out about it was not a boast, it traveled on its own legs, that if you wanted soap that lathered clean and did not take your hide, milled toilet soap of Eastern grade at a fair frontier price, you sent up Ute Creek to the Rourke Works, and you asked for the woman. Lund's Hotel bought their soap for 30 years. The Denver house shipped it down on the cars by the gross and sold it as far as Kansas City. The mining men at Silverthread washed with it until the silver played out and the camp went quiet. And then the ranchers and the townsfolk washed with it after, and there was not another works between Denver and the Divide that could say its soap was made by a master's hand, and this one could, and meant it. Adeline built the works up year by year the way she had built the first good batch, patient and exact. A bigger boiling house and a proper frame room and a milling press freighted up in pieces on their own wagons, and she took on hands and paid them fair and weighed them true. And she taught Emmett the finer trade until his caustic scarred hands could mill a bar nearly as smooth as her own, though he always said not quite. And she taught Alton Frame's nephew, and above all she taught Posey, who grew up in the sweet steam of the boiling house and could tell the strength of a lie by the swim of the egg before she was 12, and by the taste of one drop on her tongue before she was 15. the way Adeline could, the way the old German master in Cincinnati had said only one born to it ever could. And it turned out the girl was born to it. And that was a thing Adeline had not expected and came to count the dearest of all of it. That the trade Wendell Pruitt had stolen from her back east had come to live again in a motherless child on Utah Creek who had chosen her for a mother. They had 2 more children on that place in the years that followed, both born in the log house with the good stone chimney, a boy and a girl, and Adeline raised the 3 of them the way she rendered tallow, slow and clean and without scorching, with patience and a steady hand, and the chance to become what they were, and the ordinary years went by the way they do. The hard mountain winters and the gold aspen falls, the boiling and the milling and the hauling, the long summer evenings on the porch with the smell of bergamot and spruce coming off the drying racks and the creek running loud in the dark. 10,000 ordinary days that did not feel like anything much at the time and turned out, when you laid them end to end, to have been the whole of a life, and a good one. Emmett Rourke never again in his life let a man weigh his goods on another man's scale, and never again sold cheap to a smiling thief, and he lived to see his soap shipped to cities he never visited, and he would sit on the porch in his old age and look out at the boiling house steaming against the benches and shake his head slow, as if he still could not entirely believe that the widow he had sent for to stir his lie had walked up his creek road one spring evening and remade the whole accounting of his life. He died in the winter of 1919, an old man of 72, in the bed in the log house, with his wife's scarred hand in his and Posey grown and steady in the doorway, and the works still going strong down by the creek, in a life he had not seen coming off that depot platform 36 years before, and would not have traded for any other that was ever offered a man. Adeline Rourke lived 8 years past him. She ran the works with Posey to the end, and milled her last bar of bergamot soap at 73, with her hands gone to knots like old Alton's had. And she died in the spring of 1927, at the age of 72, in the same log house, on a morning when the first larkspur was coming blue along the creek and the boiling house was already steaming for the day's work. And they laid her beside Emmett on the rise above Ute Creek, where you could see the benches run up green toward the snow. She left the works to Posey, who ran it another 30 years and taught her own daughter the swim of the egg and the taste of the drop, and left the gold that had come out of a trunk lining in Cincinnati long since turned into a boiling house and a frame room and 3 children raised right. Which was, Adeline had always said, the only thing money was ever truly for, to be turned into work and into people, and not left sewn in a lining out of fear. And the works went on, because she had built it to go on, out of nothing but a chandler's daughter's nose and a soap-maker's widow's hands, and the refusal to let a good trade go to waste under a beaten man, when a slack fire and a true scale and a little patience would set it right. On a still evening up Ute Creek even now, they say, if the wind comes down off the peaks the right way, you can catch a thread of spruce and bergamot on the cold air where the old works stood, faint as memory, and a person on the road might slow and lift his head and not know the half of what he was smelling, which was the far-off trace of a thing a widow off a train had started one spring evening a long time ago and had made sure, before she was done, would outlast her. And the creek runs down past the log house and the rise where the 2 of them lie in the dark, and does not mind, and goes on.